So I'm really honored to be here today. My wife and I, Deanna, identify as Anabaptists and are part of Cedar Park Church. But I have a lot of respect and I'm very grateful for the broader church family and traditions such as the United Church. That I have a lot to learn from people like you. Over the last few months, I've been getting to know Reverend Short. And again, I feel really grateful to have met someone in this community that has a very different set of experiences from me and is someone that I can learn from and be shaped by. Before I met Jim, no less than 2 people told me some remarkable things about him. So I knew I had to get to know him. And so I come to you today as someone who wants to learn and wants to grow. And so, I'm up here talking. I've got the microphone, but maybe we can think about this as a conversation. And I'll go first, and I'll tell you a bit about myself and my life, and sort of kick things off. Maybe a little vulnerability and truth-telling, and then you can go next afterwards, and you can talk to me, and we can learn and grow together. When I spoke to Jim on the phone the other day, he was telling me about some of the things you guys have been talking about, and some of the conversations you've been having, and he gave me this question, of what does it mean to be a Christian? I think this is a good question, and one of the reasons why it's a good question is because it's a question we can't ever really fully answer or stop asking. We can always come back and ask ourselves again and again, what does it mean when I say that I'm a Christian? What does it mean when I say that I'm following Christ, that I'm publicly identifying myself with Jesus? In fact, I think that in my life, and you might relate to this as well, we might benefit from thinking about how our answer to this question, what does it mean to be a Christian, has changed across time. So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of the Good Samaritan. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to use this story as a way of thinking about this question. And I'm going to use this story as a way to talk about how my answer has changed across the course of my life. We'll see how it goes. So I've come to find now, at this point in my life, the story of the Good Samaritan deeply uncomfortable. But it's not always been the case. In my childhood, this story, like the rest of the Bible in general, was not uncomfortable, which probably goes to show how little I thought about what the Bible actually says. At this point in my life, though, most of the Bible is deeply unsettling to me in one way or another. But this was not the case when I was young, and that's surprising considering that I was educated and formed in spaces that were very Bible-centric. I grew up in a little town in Ontario, one child of 6, born to parents who were both born in Toronto. Fergus, has anybody heard of Fergus? There we go. Fergus is 20 minutes up the highway from Guelph, Ontario, just to sort of situate yourself. And it's a little river town. It was established mostly by Scottish settlers who built their homes out of the stone and the rock from the Grand River. Richard Rohr, the well-known Franciscan, has said, for many people, the path of a healthy life moves from order to disorder to reorder. And sometimes this path is harder for people because they don't begin in order. But that wasn't the case for me. I began, like Rohr, in a family and a church community that was good at order. There were clear expressions in this community about what was good and right, and clear expressions about how to live in order to be seen as good and right. Looking back, I find that some of the things that were said to be good and right no longer seem that way to me anymore, but as a place to be formed, the community of the Allure Road Christian Fellowship had much in the way of order that enabled me to establish a coherent way of knowing myself and the world. So this church community I grew up in, the Allure Road Christian Fellowship, is a non-denominational church, and it sits in the country outside the surrounding towns, and it operates its own school, which I attended until grade 8, which means I went to church 6 days a week, because the school and the church were in the same building. And I'm sure that I heard the story of the Good Samaritan, many times in those years. So what did it mean to me? As this young person, sort of deeply formed and familiar with church, deeply comfortable with the Bible. So let's go back to the text for a minute. So we just heard it. I'm gonna read the text again just so it's fresh in our minds. So a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. This is from the NRSV. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied. So we know the rest of the story of how it goes. We're familiar, if not with this picture, but with similar pictures of the Good Samaritan. And when I was a kid, in the community I was a part of, being a Christian was the default. Being a Christian was normal. And so hearing this story in that context means that this story is about a moral to be learned. And the moral is, be like the Samaritan. Be a nice guy, do good things for people who need our help. And I think that this is not an uncommon way of reading this story. And I think that for many people who identify as evangelical Christians, this gets to the heart of their identity as Christians. To be a Christian is to be a good person and do good things. So I think one of the things I've learned that's changed how I view this story is sort of a simple thing. I've learned about the Bible. I've learned what the Bible is a little bit, who wrote it and who edited it and how all these authors and editors have did what they did and some of the reasons why they might have done what they did. So I've learned a little bit about the Bible. And what that means is that where I once might have read stories like this as being about the bearers of simple morals, I saw the Bible as sort of a collection of lessons I was supposed to learn. I now come to the Bible and to this story with a different set of expectations. I come to the Bible thinking of it as a strange thing, written by people who live lives very different from mine. I don't really know what a Samaritan is, or a Levite, or a priest. I mean, I know I've studied some things, but I sort of come realizing that this is an ancient text, and what seems on the face to be simple and easily understandable might not always be the case. When I was a kid, I wanted to be seen as a good Christian who did the right things, and this story was one story along with others that sort of made up the background, the wallpaper of the ordered space of my life in church and family. When I was about 11 or 12, I was baptized at my church. And even though that process, I'm not sure how things like that happen here, explicitly prompted me, this little 11-year-old, think, what does it mean that you're identifying yourself publicly as a Christian? I'm pretty sure I didn't think about it all that much. And it was clear to me what it was that I was doing. I was trying to imitate, the slightly older kids in my church who had done this, right? It's clear that by getting baptized, you show that you're becoming more mature and you're growing up. And that's certainly all the things that I wanted to indicate to the community I was part of. So it's fair to say that around that age, by the time I'm 12, I had not really started asking myself this question, what does it mean to be a Christian? And that's sort of surprising considering the fact that I was in this, default Christian space, that we sort of kind of talked about it all the time, but mostly in the sense of the morals that we were supposed to learn and to know. So, order, disorder. And I don't know if it's inevitable that disorder always follows order. I think that some people have worked very hard in their lives not to disrupt the order and framework of their early lives. But it seems like it's really hard, actually, as you get older, to constantly make your life ordered, to sort of not allow life to disrupt. It seems to me that however healthy the order of your early life circumstances are, the world itself kind of wants to undo simplistic order. The world itself pulls you into disorder. It pulls you out of clear definitions, and it pulls you into unmapped territory. So when I first left for university, I didn't, set out to sort of be put off of my childhood way of living and knowing the world. If I remember correctly, what I did want to do is I wanted to see if I could be the same kind of person I was when I was younger, but sort of, dip my toe into a bigger pond of experiences. I first went to university in Ottawa to study aerospace engineering. And I chose Ottawa precisely over other options because it was far enough away from my parents that I wouldn't, I'd still get to see them, but not too much. This was sort of the main idea. I'd get to have a little bit of freedom. I could do some stuff, and I could have some fun. Of course, what this really means is that it was time to find a girlfriend. And by the time I went to university, maybe this reflects on the character of the community I grew up in. I had never kissed a girl. I'd never even held a girl's hand. I'd never even, talked to a girl one-on-one. So I was excited to change all those things. So one time early on in my life in Ottawa, some of my new friends convinced me to go out with them to a dance club over the bridge in Hull, Quebec. And the advantage of going to Hull, does anybody know Ottawa, Hull, that area? Yeah. Then I won't have to explain to you sort of some of the Ottawa-Hull comparisons, but there's certain advantages to going over to Quebec, and one of them is that the legal drinking age is 18. So remember, I haven't even held a girl's hand, and I've got these friends that are going to take me out for this good time. I've tasted alcohol once in my life before this, and now I'm going to go to a dance club. And at some point in the night, a miracle occurs. I end up dancing with a girl. And we start chatting a little bit, and when I think back to this conversation, I think it captures the overall state of my life at this point. She asked me what I did, and I told her I was in engineering, and then she was like, "So what are you going to do afterwards? What do you want to do after this dance club?" And I said, "Well, I probably got to get back to my dorm really soon because I've got to get up early and study in the morning." And she was like, "So then why are you here at this club?" And I'm like, "Well, it's because my friends over there asked me to come out, and I'm actually only 17, and I thought it would be easier to get in somewhere in Quebec and have some beer." And that was the end of the conversation. She found someone else to talk to. I think this little vignette sort of represents the kickoff of this period of my life where I began to have the order of my early years come apart as I moved into the larger world. A world where being a Christian was not the default. On this dance floor in Quebec, I was interested in trying out parts of this larger world, but I was still doing so from a framework that at its core assumed many things. I still operated out of an inner space that I expected other people to be watching my behavior, and I wanted to make sure that my behavior was acceptable to certain perspectives. It might not surprise you to hear that disorder in my life increased from that point on. I actually did start to take seriously the question of what does it mean to be a Christian? And I'm grateful to say, I've had the opportunity to receive quite a broad and deep education. After I did some engineering, and I went and did a broad liberal arts bachelor's degree, so I've covered everything from ancient languages and philosophy to history and literature and all this sort of stuff. But, of course, this means that I invariably learned the history of the world that tells a story of the church and of Christians that is often quite repugnant. I don't need to rattle off for you the facts of crusades, the anti-Semitic pogroms, and church-backed colonization. Forget answering the question, what does it mean to be a Christian in light of history? Who even wants to be a Christian? Christians are apparently very good at killing each other and killing everyone else and finding a way to call it good. I don't have an exact date, but at some point in the early 2000s, I reached a point in my life where hearing the story of the Good Samaritan now left a bitter taste in my mouth. There was a deep and terrible irony in the fact that the actions of the Good Samaritan were held up as an example of how to live, in contrast with the actions of the religious Jewish figures, like good guys over here and bad guys over there. But as far as I could see, Christians were far more like the people that passed by the wounded man than they were like the Samaritan. In 2006, in the last part of my bachelor's degree, I wrote a paper where I even used this story of the Good Samaritan in the introduction. At that point in time, I was very hot on philosophy and literary theory and textual criticism and postmodernism, all this kind of stuff. And I was trying to show how some of the literary criticism tools in the context of interpreting the story might work. It was a very, very clever paper. I was showing how the meaning of the text is related to the ideas associated with the labels we apply to different characters. I wrote how modern readers of the text miss the point that in the world of Luke, the author of this text, the Samaritan was the bad guy. He was a disgusting enemy. He was a terrorist, to us. In sort of in our terms, maybe he would be like ISIS, or fill in the blank for your own sort of like morally repugnant person. The Samaritan was not liked. The people who would have heard this story. And so I sort of did this clever bit of analysis showing how meaning is constructed by all these different things. And in many ways, this paper was sort of me at the peak of my disorder, even though I didn't realize at the time. But, I was full of self-important cleverness, socially constructed meaning, all this sort of stuff. I knew so much and understood so little. And in case you're waiting to hear about how my life has moved to reorder, that I've sort of come out of this space and now I can tell you what order looks like again, I'm going to tell you that I don't think that it has. Or maybe it has started to, but it's hard to tell from this point in time. In fact, I feel less sure about so many things. I ask myself the question, what does it mean to be a Christian more than ever? But I have a lot less certainty about how to answer it. I've become someone who would have been almost unimaginable to my childhood self. I'm fairly convinced that what it means to be a Christian has very little to do with knowing and professing statements of faith, and at one point in my life, that's basically all there was to it. And again, there's an irony that in the ordered space of my early life, in the parables of Jesus, like the Good Samaritan, they're not about actually conveying a moral lesson. They're about changing your life. The point is to imitate the behavior. And all it takes to know this is to actually pay attention to the story. The story begins with a man listing off the things that he knows about the moral life. The man knows the law, and he knows what's required of him. Jesus' response to the man is not to tell him a profound, new, secret truth, but to tell him a story that shows him and us what his life is supposed to look like. The purpose is not to provide a lesson, but to offer an example of how to live. So now in my ongoing disorder, I'm trying to live differently, and I'm trying very hard to imitate people. It turns out that for all of my education, I'm still in need of more. Knowing things is not enough. So who should I imitate as I try to answer the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, I have found some people, and they're the people in this book that I've put together and brought with me today. This book that Jim mentioned, although he has every single time said the title incorrectly. That's okay. Yeah, it's Hidden and Hard Work. Not that it matters a ton, but it's okay. So I set out to put this book together because for a while now I've been thinking and working a lot around questions of peace and nonviolence, and I've come to see how peace and nonviolence is perhaps best understood as an active process. Peace is something that we're working towards, or peace is maybe the place where we're actively working for restoration and reconciliation. Peace is the place of inclusion and truth-telling. And I put together this book because I wanted to know and share the stories of people who have been doing this work in and around the place where I live. So I'm gonna finish by actually reading a little bit from the book. And I'm going to finish with their stories. So it's a collection of 8 stories of different people. And I'm going to finish with their stories because this is where my story is at. I want to be like these people. I'm not sure where I'm at in becoming the Samaritan, although I likely am still an enemy and repulsive to many people. I'm still mostly like the Levite or the priest. Or maybe mostly the lawyer. But hopefully by imitating these people, I will become like them. Hopefully by imitating these people, I will know what it means to be a Christian. So in the book, this is a thing that I do, aside from being a scientist, I put together a little publishing company, So I'm the publisher and editor. I do have a little bit of an intro, but it's other people's words, it's other people's stories. And there's 8 stories in this book. And I wanted to gather stories. As I was looking around for examples of people who do peace work, I realized I only knew examples of people who do this kind of stuff in other contexts. And I thought it was important for me and maybe other people to know the people who are doing the stuff that I wanted to imitate here. So all these stories, all 8 of them, are people in and around us, in and around Vancouver. So, and they range. Some of these stories might sound like peacemaking to you, and some of them might not, but you've got everything from, the first story is Frank Sawatsky's story. I don't know how many of you know Frank. He's a longtime teacher and counselor in his community, but he also worked for a long time for an organization called COSA, which is Circles of Support and Accountability. And let me read you a little bit of Frank's story, just as a teaser. I'm going to read you a couple of pages from this. So Frank says, "The desire to be a peacemaker has taken me to places I would never have anticipated. Working with sex offenders released from prison into the community is not something I thought I would do. Soon after retiring from teaching in 2009, an opportunity arose for me to become a coordinator with Circles of Support and Accountability. I'd never heard of this organization, but I was intrigued when I learned that when sexual offenders released from prison join a COSA circle, recidivism, relapse of criminal behavior, is reduced by as much as 80%. For so many years, as a teacher and counselor, I'd supported students who were victims of abuse. Here was an opportunity to help reduce sexual violence its many lifelong consequences in my community." So that's Frank's story. It's sort of the first chapter in the book. I know Frank, and he very kindly and gently forced me to volunteer for this organization, which I do. It's very unpleasant work, but how are we going to have peaceful homes and communities if we're not actively engaged in doing the messy stuff that's out of sight that needs to be done? And there's more stories. So after Frank is Lauren. He runs Kinbrace, this organization that supports people who are seeking asylum in Canada. That's in East Vancouver. Zara Tinholt talks about her work connecting with the Muslim community and how that came about through a lot of disorder that appeared in her life. Her daughter, Addie, started a refugee sponsoring organization. Addie's story is in here as well. And they sponsored Syrian families. Addie's like 10 years old. Nikki Frew, her story is in this book. She works in foster care. She, gives kids that need a safe place to grow and be formed a home. Jody Sparger is another great story in here. Maybe I'll read a few words from Jody. So Jody works in efforts for reconciliation between churches and Indigenous people. She works for an organization called Healing at the Wounding Place. The wounding place is us, the church, right? We're the ones who've been doing the wounding. So this is a few words of Jody's. "I'm not naturally a person of peace, nor do I come from a people or tradition of peace. I envy the Mennonite heritage of peacemaking and war resisting. I come from a long line of brawlers and soldiers, and perhaps even more basically, I recognize violence running within me, ever present and powerful. Any impulse towards peace is a work of the Spirit, an almost visceral experience of cool water being poured over a blistering burn." Jody's story is another great story. And I have gotten to know her a bit and have been very affected by the work that she does. So that's just a taste. There's more stories. There's Beth's story. Beth works for an organization called Generous Space, this fantastic group that tries to create safe places for LGBTQ folks who don't find churches especially welcoming, or maybe people that don't find, haven't found a safe, spiritual community yet, and they work to sort of make, people like me better able to see the ways in which my life hurts people like her, and she's just so kind and so good at it. So she tells the story of her life and coming to meet her wife, Denise, and the work that she does. So all these people are the stories in this book, and I'm excited to share them with you today because they are the people that I'm trying to imitate. They are the people that I'm trying to use as an example of how to become like the Good Samaritan. So I'll be here afterwards if you would like to come and read these stories for yourself and hopefully join me in being shaped by them. So thank you.
I didn't say I was going to do this, but anybody got a question or a thought for Matt? Yeah, you're all saying, yeah, Jim, you never do